And welcome to the June 8th meeting of the Historic Resources Board. Would staff please call roll?
Chair Bernstein.
Here.
Vice Chair Wimmer. Here. Board Member Bauer.
Here.
Board Member Corey. Here. Board Member Bunnenberg. Here. Board Member Kohler. And Board Member McKinnon. Here.
Okay. Thank you. Next is oral communications. The public may speak to any item not on the agenda, 3 minutes per speaker. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak to us? And we seeing none, moving on to, are there any agenda changes, additions, and deletions?
Only to report that Amy regrets not being here this morning. I'm Jonathan Late, the Assistant Director for the Planning and Community Environment Department, filling in for Amy. And I'm here with Emily to help in any way that we can with your study session discussion.
Okay, thank you. Next, city official reports. None to report for board meeting schedule and assignments. Study session. Public comment is permitted, 3 minutes per speaker. The study session is on Mills Act discussion. Any introduction? Any introduction by staff on this topic?
So let me just first introduce Sandy Lee, who's an attorney with the City Attorney's Office. And I don't know if individually if you had a chance to meet her, but she's joining us on this discussion to answer any questions that may come up from a legal perspective. So welcome, Sandy. Thanks for being here.
Welcome, Sandy.
Yeah, so we don't have any formal presentation for this. I understand this is an item that was continued from a previous meeting, and we're here to listen to the board's conversation on the matter.
Great. Okay, thank you. So let's then open that up to the board for continuing the conversation about Mills Act. Are there any board members who would like to start? Beth, you have your light on. Beth, you have your light on? Okay. Okay. Any board members like to start with the comments, please? Vice Chair Bauer.
If the chair would allow, I would be happy to review what the subcommittee prepared. It's part of our packet. But I think I'd actually like to hear from the City Attorney's Office, because I presume you've seen the sketch of what we're proposing, and I'm curious to know what the City Attorney's Office has to add or suggest in regard to that, or in any other capacity. I presume that you're here to talk to us about this from the City Attorney's Office perspective.
Good morning. So I have had a chance to review this, the subcommittee's work product to date, and there are several aspects of it that I think will potentially work in a program that the city puts forth, but there are some aspects that we would need to think about. As you know, the Mills Act program is authorized under state law, so there are some state law limitations on what a local program can look like. There's also significant local discretion in terms of the administration of the program. Typically, it's adopted, a formal program would be adopted by ordinance. An informal program, for instance, a pilot program that is contemplated could be adopted by a resolution. The Mills Act contracts do run for a minimum of 10 years. When notice of non-renewal is put forward, that basically means that it continues for 10 years and then it will end, and the property tax incentive will reduce over time. In the 10th year, it will return to what it would otherwise be, the tax rate. There are certain aspects like the amount of the tax adjustment that may well be out of our hands as a local jurisdiction. The assessor's office for the county would handle that, and to my knowledge, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, that distinction is not made. I think it would be administratively cumbersome, even if it's authorized under the law. The primary focus, I think, of a Mills Act program would be determining eligibility. There's minimum eligibility requirements under state law. The property must be on the National Register or a local register. So if a property is not currently on the local register, the application for a Mills Act contract would likely go forward with an application to put that property on the local register. And those could go through the Historic Resources Board for recommendation together and would be acted upon by the City Council. There's one item on this list about properties being open to the public that I think may be problematic. I believe in 1985, I can't quite remember the year that the Mills Act was amended, but previously there was a requirement that properties be open once a year, but that item was removed from the state law, so we may not want to include that in case that conflict presents a problem. The application fee item that's addressed in this recommendation, we are limited in terms of what we can require for an application fee. State law says essentially that it's based on cost recovery. So unless a property of significant value requires more administrative work on the part of staff, you wouldn't be able to assess different amounts for the application based on property value. So these are all, this is just kind of an outline of Mills Act requirements and our local discretion. And my understanding is that staff will take the recommendations from the Historic Resources Board and work to...
Yeah, if we get council direction. Yeah.
I'll let the Assistant Director speak to this.
Right, so this is sort of a starting place for developing a program, and as I think you know, you're scheduled to have a meeting with the City Council, a joint meeting, I think in August. So that would be a time to present this, and if we get council direction, this is the starting place for us to go forward in developing the program.
Okay. August, I'm not familiar if we have an established date yet, but if there is a date, that'd be great.
Yeah, we think it's August 28th, but I'll make sure that we confirm that and send an email out to the board members.
Okay, great, thank you. CC and HRP. Okay. Vice Chair Bauer, thank you for those comments. Any other board members, including board members that were on that subcommittee? Any comments? Or David, if you have more comments? Yeah.
Thank you for that. That makes it a little bit easier to craft this. I think that what I'd like to do is just go over this proposal. And again, I want to stress that this is it's an outline of what we think we can do, and there would be much more to add to this to actually make it and qualify as an ordinance to be presented, a proposed ordinance to be presented to the council. But when we put this together, and Corey and Margaret were the other two members of the subcommittee, the idea was to summarize some of the past experiences or attempts by the Historic Resources Board to create a Mills Act that would help, Palo Alto could then offer to the community. In the eligibility section, and again, I'm not an attorney and I don't write ordinance code either, so I mean, I'm responsible primarily for the language. The idea was that all Category 1 to 4 buildings would be eligible automatically, but also to capture other buildings that aren't categorized currently. And we have had those properties come before the Historic Resources Board and ask to be included, and then we as a board have made a determination. Usually they come before the board because they're interested in the California Historic Building Code application, which helps historic buildings. So whatever language we use, I think the purpose of this first paragraph is to capture any building that's not already categorized as a 1 to 4 building. So we don't want to exclude any building that would have historic significance but just hasn't been on the register. So secondly, local requirements. Of course, all of this has to comply with state law. The structure would be 10-year period, which I think is standard. That the maximum, we're proposing $1 million in property value and as a redirection. And I think what's important to understand is that when the purpose of this proposal and the Mills Act program, if it's enacted in Palo Alto, is not to eliminate property taxes, but to redirect the same amount of property tax towards the rehabilitation and the preservation of historic buildings. So there's going to be a tax savings, but there's not going to be a dollar for dollar savings. So by being a member of this group of Mills Act participants, you're still going to spend the money you would have spent on property taxes, but it's redirected to preservation of the building. And the $1 million amount is probably conservative. And then I'm not sure how, I know that there are 3 different ways the assessor can provide the number. So I'm not, and I read that over and over and I don't understand it. So somebody else is going to have to do that calculation. But I think that the 3 of us felt that maybe $1.5 million of assessed value would be more appropriate, especially in a city like Palo Alto, where the property values are extraordinarily high. Roughly $1 million of tax redirected tax funds would be about $12,000 a year. And if it ran for 12 years, it would be $120,000 for a single contract. And we're proposing to start with 10 to see if there is interest and see how we can move this forward. So if it went to 1.5 million, it's a little higher, but not significantly higher. I think the projects, of course, have to be approved by planning. Presumably, I would assume they'd come before the HRB, but I'm not sure that that's required, and it's not in this proposal. I don't know whether that's necessary. Most important is that the kinds of projects that would be appropriate for a Mills Act contract would be those projects that retain the historic character of the building as a requirement, but also ensure that the building is upgraded. And in other Mills Act, other communities have adopted Mills Act programs. The first thing that they want is the building to be anchored to the foundation, which typically is very difficult in a historic building, and that usually requires a new foundation, or some kind of structural upgrade after that, so that, again, the building is more resilient during an earthquake. Other kinds of projects could include window replacement, so that which tends to be a vulnerable point of historic buildings. Electrical upgrades, because many historic buildings have very old wiring systems and they don't provide enough safe power to a modern house uses appliances. And then, weatherization projects. One considers, say, a 10-year program at let's just say the $1 million level, and you had $12,000 to spend per year. $120,000 probably wouldn't replace the foundation of any building in Palo Alto. So this is a relatively small amount of funding for major projects. And the purpose, in some way, I thought we should have language in here that allowed an owner to accumulate the funding or to make a plan with the planning department that allowed for the full 10-year funding to affect a project. And I'm not sure how that would work, but because you can't spend 10 years paying off your contractor for a new foundation. So somehow that has to be worked out in language that can only imagine. The application fees in the projects that I reviewed in other cities, the application fees for mills contracts in other cities varied a lot. Oakland waives all design review fees in their program. In the seminar that I attended on the Mills Act that focused on Southern California communities, they also had very minimal fees. Some didn't charge any fees. So the purpose of that is, again, to encourage that the funding for these projects, these construction projects, is focused on the needs of the building to preserve and extend its lifetime. So that's why in this, under item 6, the base application fee is just X's. I don't know, city staff would have to figure that out. And then penalties, that's, I think, a state law issue, and I just took language right out of Dennis Backlund's earlier proposal. So I wanted to also address one other thing. In this proposal, we're focusing on residential properties, and I understand and appreciate that commercial properties have the same value to the community, but I think we felt that commercial properties have many other incentives, especially in downtown Palo Alto. And as a result, the biggest incentive, of course, the commercial property has is that it has rent income that can accelerate rapidly, in many cases, triple net leases. And so there was less of a need for that. Downtown Palo Alto buildings have TDR incentives. So at this point, we're focusing this on just residential properties, but I would hope that the rest of my board members would review that and offer insight. I guess that's my my sort of overview of this.
Vice Chair Bauer has brought up a common theme that I've heard on the HRB, including my common theme, is that to encourage and foster the idea of historic preservation is to lessen the burden of applicants who have historic buildings. And so Vice Chair Bauer talked about on his eligibility, if it's category 1 through 4 or nationally registered or California register, even only eligible for those listings. It's because it still has to have an application process. So I think you're proposing this is not a right. You still have to apply for it, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. So by having this proposal being not as a right to the Mills Act contract approval, it still has to have an approval process, but just make it easier to enter into that application process. I mean, if the cultural goal of Palo Alto is to encourage historic preservation, make it easy. Again, we're not proposing a right, so it still has to be applied, but just make it easier to apply. Does that summarize one of your goals of eligibility?
Exactly, and I think that from a process standpoint, prior to any Mills Act application, we ought to have a separate HRB hearing about the eligibility so that we don't move down the planning, we don't start using planning staff time to review projects before we know whether the project the building is eligible. So I think they could be combined, but I think staff would have to tell us what's the most appropriate way to do this.
Other board members? Board Member Bunnenberg.
Yes, I would like to inquire about whether there is a yearly reporting that the recipient of the Mills Act needs to do. It seems to me that that's been one place where we've really fallen down in terms of not asking you received so much money this year. What did you spend it on? And, you know, if necessary, even some check by one member of the planning staff to see whatever progress is there. Did you consider that?
I think that's required. I think that's probably a state, isn't that a state law requirement?
So the state law requires that, that an exterior and interior inspection be conducted every 5 years by city staff. However, an annual reporting requirement could be included. So state law is silent as to that, but that would be within the purview of the local jurisdiction to include that in the program and then include it in the contract.
Okay. I would certainly expect that to be the case. Can I ask one other question? I read the contract, the only existing contract we have in Palo Alto, which is with the Squire House owners. I didn't see any language in that contract, and this is a very old contract, that required anything to be done to the building. There was no requirement for that I could see delineated. Am I missing something?
I haven't seen that contract, so I can't really speak to that.
I'd only say that in speaking with Amy French about it, I had a similar question about it and asking, you know, so where's the benefit going? And it doesn't seem that there's any identified benefit in that particular contract.
Yeah, well, that was my impression. And so this proposal is designed to actually specify a benefit, because there's no point in the city of Palo Alto entering into an agreement that doesn't benefit the residents.
And of course, the Squire House also had the facade easement, which was, I assume, not part of the Mills Act, but the front was to be preserved.
Right.
City
And
Attorney?
maybe the front 2 rooms.
Sandy Lee?
I just wanted to add that what Board Member Bauer, or Vice Chair Bauer, observed is a reason why the city may be better served by adopting some sort of program that would provide for those types of requirements. I believe previously the city of Palo Alto, when it entered into this Mills Act contract, and there may have been one other, they were done pretty much on their own without vetting of a process for and general requirements for these contracts.
Board Member McKinnon.
Yes, I had just a question whether the state law mandates any maximum tax adjustment levels. I mean, the pilot program here is proposing $1 million. Is there any language in the state law that restricts that, or is it?
No, there's no restriction with respect to that.
Okay.
So the city could decide that the value of the property not exceed a certain dollar amount to be eligible for the program in this jurisdiction.
Okay. Other board members? Board Member Corey.
I did have one question as far as David's comments on specifying. So can we put in language to say, since it's not a right, that it, for instance, that it could only be applied to residences or could only be applied to certain things? Is that within our jurisdiction?
Yes. I just wanted to point out that this is a contract between the city and the property owner. So even if the city felt that a minimum threshold of the requirements were made, it's still a negotiated contract. I think what we would contemplate, though, is having a template agreement so that we don't have to do a lot of negotiation for each Mills Act contract.
Vice Chair Bauer.
So along those lines, It seems to me to make this a successful program, we need to have examples of the kinds of projects that we want to encourage in the ordinance. Does that make sense? Is that something that's valuable or useful?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is one major function of the adopted program, is really specifying what are the eligibility requirements, what types of structures, properties the city would like to see benefited through a Mills Act program.
Board Member Corey, did you have your question? Yeah. Okay, yeah. All right. Board Member Wimmer.
Yeah, so I think there are several precedents of this program in other cities, and we've had it here ourselves. But there's some information from the Office of Historic Preservation. I mean, I just have some information in my notes. So I think, I mean, we should just sort of follow the state lead on what the state's already established for this program. And in terms of adopting it for ourselves, I think that, I mean, first, I think we just have to find some willing participants. But I mean, since it's a state program and since the city of Palo Alto has already engaged in these contracts, I mean, what is holding us up from continuing this or having, I mean, do we have to get approval from the city council to do this? It seems like it's already an established program. We just don't have any participants willing to go through the process. I mean, obviously we have one contract, and we've heard that they are interested in canceling their contract. But I just think that I think as a city, we just need to put the opportunity out there and allow our residents to realize and maybe learn for the first time that this is something that's an established program and that it's available. And I guess the impact is on the city staff because it does require more of their time and work. But I think it just seems like there's a lot of information that's already established on the program, and other cities have, like applications and things that we can use as a guideline, and how other cities have gone about offering this to their residents.
City Attorney Sandy Lee.
So cities that have programs typically adopt ordinances setting out more clearly what the eligibility requirements are for that jurisdiction. I'm not sure I would describe this as a state program. The state provides authorization for local jurisdictions to create a program consistent with state law. There are different programs in every city. So in terms of the number of contracts a city might want to enter into per year, the types of buildings that they would like to see eligible for the program, where the historic preservation need is the greatest, whether a preservation requirement needs to be supplemented by a requirement to rehabilitate, the amount of property value that the city is willing to include in the program, monitoring requirements such as reporting, all of these things, I think, to make sure that the public is aware that this is available, it would be much more clear and transparent for the city to have a true adopted program through an ordinance or by resolution.
I do see on our staff report the Mills Act pilot program in our packet that Vice Chair Bauer has referenced. It says the purpose of this program is to establish a basis for instituting a permanent incentive program. So the program already exists. Is that correct? Oh, City Attorney Lee.
I don't think I would say a program exists. We have entered into one or two contracts. program, is typically, setting out the parameters for, who may participate. As I mentioned, the state law actually has a pretty minimal threshold for eligibility of properties. So in order to, truly, if the city wants to exercise its jurisdiction to specify something further, then that should be laid out in, either a policy adopted by resolution or an ordinance.
So the process right now, if a property owner wants to enter into a Mills Act contract, the city they just make that request to, who do they make the request to? Yeah.
So I think, I don't know how the Squire House got, set up, but I'd actually say we don't have a program. We don't have a Mills Act program. And so if somebody wanted to take advantage of this incentive program, I'd say, you're kind of out of luck right now. We need to establish that program either by ordinance or resolution to get it established. And I think that's, why this board is tackling that important issue.
Good.
I just wanted to mention, there is somewhere online that the city of Palo Alto is listed under Mills Act. It has Matthew Weintraub on this matrix, because for each jurisdiction, it lists who the contact person is. And I think this is a 2000, this document is February of 2015, but we are listed here with Matthew Weintraub and his email address. I don't know who generated this list, because it's like of all the cities. So someone is generating a list, and we are identified on it. Just
right.
FYI.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at that list now. It's from the Office of Historic Preservation.
Right.
It's got the list of everybody's
that's
things.
right.
So we clearly need to update that, and I think, while we don't have a Mills Act program, we have a Mills Act property, and I think that we're taking advantage of that opportunity to sort of promote our historic preservation interests with the state, and I think that there's an opportunity for us to take a giant step forward in enhancing that program.
Okay, so that'll support, Board Member Corey.
So I had seen that report or noticed that as well, and when I talked to Shannon at the state, she said if you have an existing Mills Act property, that they put you on that list, and but that doesn't mean we can actually add new properties. And I will say that there's clearly doesn't seem to be an existing program, because I talked to a neighbor who actually told me that they called a couple years ago and tried to get a Mills Act property and spoke to Dennis. I think it was about 5 years ago. And that was the best he could, and the best they could figure out was there was no existing way for a new applicant to apply. They said they would have to go to the city council at the very least, but there was no existing process. We had existing properties, but we would have to put a new process in place. So at least that's what the public is being told when they call, so, to talk to planning, so.
Yes, Historic Planner Vance.
All right, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm really excited that we're having this discussion all together. I think we're all in agreement that a program doesn't currently exist. So I would like to guide our discussion back to really fleshing out some of the, what we want this program to be. If we can create a strong, robust Mills Act program in Palo Alto instead of these kind of picking here and there. My biggest questions to the HRB would be what are the community's needs and priorities that can be addressed through this Mills Act program? What properties do we want to prioritize? And also, what kind of pushback can you envision? Because I've been hearing lots of chatter about resistance to this program. So there are three major things that I would like to continue our discussion on.
Thank you for that. Board Member Corey, did you have your, yeah.
So resistance to the program, where has that been coming from? I've heard about property taxes, or about, the school boards?
Yes, that's what I've been hearing. Since our public schools get 71% of their money from local property taxes, any kind of pulling from that fund is going to be seen as taking from it. But I believe there are some answers to that question, at least from the earlier paperwork.
Board Member Pettenberg.
But that would include the right to make some monetary limits in terms of how many contracts, what amount the contracts would be, so that it's something that we in fact could pretty well control.
Yeah, Vice Chair Bauer.
I think historically in Palo Alto, there's been pushback from the school district about any revenue that would be redirected from their budget. I did some research on the 2016-17 school district budget just to get a sense of what funds they had to work with. Their budget for that, this is the school year that's just ending, was $231.5 million. And of that, they get 74.7%, or $165,772,079 from property taxes. So out of, and they, I learned from the finance department, the city's finance department, that Palo Alto School District gets 54% of all property tax dollars. County gets 23%, then Palo Alto gets 8%, the Foothill College District gets 6%, Santa Clara Valley Water gets 4%, and then 5% goes to other places. So in thinking about the cost of this program over a 10-year period, which would be $1.5 million per year if we had 10 contracts times 10, and then looking at a $231 million budget, which over 10 years would be $2.3 billion if it was just fixed. And I'm not making assumptions about whether that taxes stay the same, because they never do. They do go up and down. That's a drop in the bucket, really, for any of the entities that are collecting property taxes. And since we have an equal interest in having not only strong schools, which of course I support. I went 12 years to school in Palo Alto, as did my parents, my children, maybe my grandson. So I don't want any misunderstanding to occur. It's important to have strong schools in Palo Alto. It's one of the reasons people want to live here, and that's one of the reasons why I live here still. Nonetheless, we have lots of issues and lots of needs in the city, and we can't focus entirely on one. So I think it's a reasonable amount of money to think about spending. So I think that that's something we address when we actually have a program to propose. This is the fleshing out period. We're still trying to think about it. I wonder if we could go back to one thing that I mentioned earlier, commercial versus residential. I'm open to commercial properties being included in this program. I don't really think I want to exclude them, but I think we should have limits on, if a commercial property, for instance, has any other source of incentive, that they would not be able to apply for a Mills Act. So I don't want somebody who gets TDRs and sells them off to then get another benefit. But maybe that's not, I don't know if that's legal, but I suppose we can define the program in any way that we want, as long as we're not contravening some law. But I'd like to hear my other board members.
Historic planner Emily had a quick comment.
Yeah, regarding using only residential for the pilot program, I would strongly encourage including all property types, industrial, any kind of public space, commercial, residential. Otherwise, these are going to be viewed as just private homes that can only be enjoyed by a very small amount of people, as opposed to a commercial space or a public place where the entire community would be able to see the benefits of having a Mills Act property. So I think it should absolutely be opened to all property types, including potentially even schools, if that would be something we could work in. I know, I understand that there's some issues with that, but if there's some way that we can pick the buildings we want to prioritize, that would be a good thing to do.
Board Member McKinnon.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bernstein. Is there any experience that we have with other communities throughout California, whether they have like industrial sites or commercial sites in their mills programs? Does anybody have any knowledge on that?
Yeah, there's For example, in Beverly Hills, there's a theater that was a Mills Act property, a historic theater that they renovated and put to wonderful use.
Well, that's a very good example. Of some of the theaters right now are in dire need of preservations. Also comes to mind like places like bowling alleys are susceptible to, destruction. So I think it makes a lot of sense to consider other than residential properties as part of this program.
Historic planner Emily Vance mentioned a question about community's needs, and as Vice Chair Bauer mentioned, yeah, so school funding is a community need. And then also the other need of, or value that we're discussing is about just historic preservation in itself, the quality of neighborhoods. Look at historic districts. We've had the common comment about, well, here's another historic structure in a historic district being demolished or being delisted, and then that starts degrading perhaps the definition of a district. So that's another community need that some groups have expressed. Okay. Board Member Bunenberg. Board Member Bunenberg, yeah.
Yes, and I would point out that Palo Alto High School is on the historic inventory. So it could profit from.
City Attorney Sandy Lee.
I just wanted to point out that under state law, that a qualified historical property means a privately owned property that is not otherwise exempt from property tax.
Okay, so that would eliminate commercial buildings. Oh, no, just public, okay, I understand, thank you. Okay. So one of the goals is to get this program activated as a pilot program. Board Member Corey.
So the one thing I'd like to encourage as I guess we finally put this together is that we make it really simple. I want to make sure we do keep a balance between, if we're going to keep the balance between residential and commercial, that's assuming everybody's okay with that sounds reasonable. But I do want to make sure that we have a process in place where we don't have to review every one of the, it seems like it would be a big burden to have to review every one of these or have every one of these go through the city council. So is there a way we can form this so that it's generic enough that it doesn't put a big burden per property, but also addresses, the concerns like David has of, I think when we talked about priorities for people doing individual upgrades on their property, one of the things we felt was we didn't want people to use it, for instance, for remodeling kitchens, right? Things of that nature. And how do we word something like that where we can say we can prioritize things or have it so that the process is a bit simpler, so that these processes can go through without a lot of intervention for every single one. Because I feel if we're going to end up having to look at every single one, assuming we get activity and we get interest from the public, that it could be a kind of a big pain. So how do we make this simple so that there's rules that kind of can get these through? I think that's going to be important, because nobody's going to want to go to the city council and have to deal with that. Not only do we not want that, I don't think the public's going to want that, because that is a burden.
Any response from the rest of the committee on that question?
So I guess if an applicant came in wanting to benefit from this program, I guess would that be a staff review? Like we were just saying, it wouldn't have to necessarily come in front of our board, but I guess the city council would have to approve the overall program. But I think you're right, making it very easy to understand and user-friendly. So maybe that's our next step, to take on the great work that David has done and put together an actual package of some sort of instruction sheets and sample application forms and things that maybe we can kind of put a package together that is more or less the instructional information and the application process, put a draft together of that.
And I would propose, for instance, if we were concerned about residential versus commercial, we could put in, out of the 10, 6 should be residential and 4 should be commercial or something like that. And then if we hit those limits, we can have a conversation. But that way, again, you have a process where you don't have to say, oh, well, we have 9 commercial, should we really approve another, or what have you, right?
So, we're both, okay. So I think, we're also, staff would be interested in having a process that was streamlined and orderly and not burdensome, not only to applicants, but also to staff resources. And I think there's a tremendous amount of examples that exist. I mean, I think there's some close to 90 cities that are participating in the Mills Act program in California. And, some of us have worked in organizations where they have robust Mills Act programs. So I think the staff that is before you even has a whole lot of experience working with this. And so we can certainly put together some, a flow chart and a path and, a process together that we would present to the HRB as sort of a framework for how we want to do that. Because the city is entering into an agreement with a property owner, the council is going to have to be involved on some level. And so it doesn't mean that there has to be a public hearing. It could be something that's done on consent, and we can move it along that way. I also don't think, despite all of our best efforts to develop a very robust and comprehensive program, that should something like that get adopted, I don't think we're going to get a whole rush of applications coming in. In my experience, if we get 1 or 2 of these coming in a year, I think we'd be excited about that, and that's a workload that we certainly can manage. So I wouldn't want to develop a program that was fearful of an onslaught of applications. That should be, we should be, fortunate enough to be in a situation where we can sort of pick and choose the projects that we want that go forward. So I'm not concerned about that, and I'm usually the one waving the flag about impacts to staff resources and things like that. But I'm not concerned about it in this context.
That's great feedback. I guess my feeling was more about, is there a lot of process involved for the applicants where it becomes so burdensome and that they don't want to actually do in the first place? I can imagine having a city council meeting where they have to talk about it, and there's members from the public and from the school board coming up saying, oh, this is bad for the schools, and and then it's just no one wants to, or a year process, and no one is going to want to go through it. So in order to incentivize, we should make sure that's where I was more focusing on the streamline. I agree that I don't think there's going to be people knocking on the door, but that's great feedback.
Yeah, and just to that point, I think that conversation is probably going to get vetted out in the development of the program. And, maybe for the first couple of applications that come in, we may hear some comments from supporters and from people who may be, against the program. But I think that gets ironed out over time. And, you're right. You've actually mentioned the need for to be thinking about our application fees and making sure that the barrier to entry is not so high that we discourage people from wanting to enter into the process.
Board Member McKinnon? Oh, did you? Yeah, please.
Yeah, that was exactly my thought. The application fees should be minimal or perhaps non-existent, just to encourage people to get into the program. If we decide that we have overwhelming subscription to the program, we can institute some fees on it at that time. But I think for a pilot program, you want to keep the fees almost down to nothing to see what type of interest you get.
I wonder if you could, staff could develop your part of this and in some kind of outlined form, and then share it with the subcommittee so we could see what your concerns are prior to having the board see it for the first time at, say, a board meeting. I'm thinking that, we're at the beginning of this process. I can't imagine this would actually now go before this council because of the complexity of developing a process like this. And summer is horrible for the council. And then when council comes back from vacation, fall, there's always a heavily compacted council agenda. So we've been talking about this for 2 years, and we want to get this done. We want to get it done in a coherent manner. So maybe we could try to share the program outline and the staff concerns with the council when we meet with them in August. Just as a preliminary, here's what we have, tell us what you think about this approach.
Yeah, I think in response to that, I think that what we can do is, I think there's probably more information that we can give the board or the subcommittee, however you want to work through it, and sort of collect more information, sort of pros, cons, pitfalls, things to be aware of, just important, priorities. You've already talked a little bit about the types of structures that you want to see included. We've talked about incentives such as waiving fees. We can put all this together in some kind of a report that, with the intent that we're trying to capture the board's interest in this program, so that when you do have that meeting with the city council, all board members are aware of what your interests are, and that we've had some preliminary conversations about this, and so that can be presented to the city council, and they can say, hey, sounds like a great idea, or we have some concerns, or go back and study this, but at least we have a foundation by which to think about the program. And so, I think Emily would be more than happy to participate in that process, working with the subcommittee, and then coming back to the board and just kind of sharing, what we've learned from some other cities and how this might, put together the beginnings of this for you.
So I'm recommending the subcommittee because we can do that in an informal basis.
Yes.
We can't do anything with the whole board without doing it in this room. So,
Okay, yeah, subcommittee's fine.
The subcommittee can look at it, and then, we can work through those issues. And of course, all board members have input when we get it to the point where we want to present it to the public.
That sounds great.
So I'm not trying to exclude any board members, just trying to make the process, more flexible.
Board Member Corey.
So one question. So if we put together a framework that goes through the city council and gets approved for, say, 10 properties with a certain set of requirements and set of objectives, does that still mean that each property would actually have to go through the city council to be approved? Is that
Each individual contract would be reviewed independently.
So hypothetically, if the contract was identical but just had a different address, and there's no way we could templatize that would have to go through each one?
Yeah, we could develop a template. There might be some, fine tuning between one property and the next. Your work program over the next 10 years of how you're going to invest the property tax savings into the work is going to be different for, probably each project. But the process could be one that is streamlined, and the only reason it would get pulled off consent is if there was some kind of controversy associated with it.
And do we have to lay out in the contract the actual work ahead of time, or is there something don't we have the flexibility to do that on an ongoing basis?
So my experience, and others may have some different perspective on this, is that you're entering into a contract for 10 years. I'd like to see 10 years worth of improvements that you're planning on your structure. Now that may change over time, and we can amend it. We can amend the contract, but we want to have a sense that this money is being used to rehabilitate the historic resource.
Got it.
Board Member Bunnerberg.
And once it gets started, there is, of course, the process of put it on the consent calendar for the council, and if it becomes enough of a routine, why they could put it on, and then only when council members ask to pull it would they have full discussion.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
So a possible action plan is by August of our joint City Council Historic Board. Is that then that could be a time where the HRB then asks the City Council during that joint study session, joint meeting, council members, what do you guys think? And about putting it on, adopting our pilot program.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good.
Can you confirm the council HRB meeting date? You
Yeah.
mentioned August 28th.
Yeah, well, that's my understanding, and we'll send an email confirmation about that date.
Because, it gets tougher and tougher the farther we get into summer, which seems not to have arrived yet, but
Well, I think we've been trying to schedule this for almost a year now.
I know. Well,
So-
and some years we never meet with the council because they have so many
I think last year was one of them.
higher priorities.
Yeah.
But at any rate, if you can, I know that it's not your decision, but if you can get any information to us as soon as possible, would be helpful.
Yeah, certainly happy to do that. I want to just make one, I want to clarify our sort of a work distinction. I mean, we're going to put together some data from other cities, talk about the framework and outline, develop your outline further with the subcommittee. The work of developing the program, getting some ordinance and some code language and vetting all that stuff out, that would happen after the council endorsed the program and asked us to go develop that. Okay.
Any other discussion, comments on this agenda item? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your valuable comments to this. Good. Okay, next is on our agenda is action items. I see none listed on our agenda. Next is approval of minutes of April 27th. Any motion to approve or amendments? Okay.
I saw no issues, so I move that we approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay, any comments? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously, thank you. Next is subcommittee items. I think we've already addressed some of those already, I believe. Board member questions, comments, and announcements, any? Seeing none, that brings us to adjournment. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. Okay, that's, we're done, thank you.